In popular imagination, the medieval assassin is a romantic figure, cloaked in black, moving like a shadow, blades hidden in his sleeves, vanishing after a flawless kill. But this vision is pure myth. In reality, the assassin's world was filthy, dangerous, and short-lived. There were no creeds, no brotherhoods, just desperate men crouching in piss-stained alleys with shaking hands and rusty knives. The assassin was not a skilled warrior or trained killer. He was a man with nothing to lose, often an outcast, a criminal, or a starving peasant. These weren't noble mercenaries. They were expendable tools, paid just enough to risk their lives and quickly forgotten once the job was done. Forget elegant daggers or exotic poisons. The assassin's weapons were whatever could be stolen, hidden, or disguised. Kitchen knives, farming tools, bone clubs. There was nothing graceful about their work, just fast violence and panic. These were not the tools of trained killers, but of men who killed because they had no other way to live. Escaping after a kill was often harder than the kill itself. Cities were cramped, loud, and dangerous. Narrow streets twisted into dead ends. Dogs barked at the scent of blood. Suspicious neighbors watched every stranger. One wrong step meant being cornered by guards or beaten to death by a mob before you reached the gate. Poison seemed like a clever solution, but it rarely worked. Most poisons were slow, unreliable, or dangerously easy to trace. Mixing the wrong dose could mean killing the wrong person, or poisoning yourself. And if the victim survived the first wave of nausea, they could name you before they died. The assassin didn't scale towers or sneak through castles. He waited in muck, behind hay bales, in stables, under broken carts. Hours spent crouching in darkness, knees aching, muscles numb, breath held. This wasn't a test of stealth. It was a test of endurance, patience, and raw nerves. Your client might smile and pay you, or kill you the moment the job was done. Nobles, merchants, even clergy. They all hired in secret, but trusted no one. To them, the assassin was a liability to be erased. You completed your mission always wondering if a knife was coming for you next. No one mourned an assassin. If you were lucky, your body rotted in a ditch. If you were caught, your end was worse. Public hanging, torture, or mutilation. You died screaming while townsfolk cheered. There were no ballads, no headstones, just the echo of your death fading into muddy ground. If you were seen, there were no trials. Guards didn't ask questions. They beat you senseless, or ran you through with a sword. Justice was swift and brutal. Once you were labeled a murderer, no one cared who hired you or why. The executioner's axe came quickly. There was no retirement for an assassin. You lived every day in fear, of the law, of betrayal, of death. Even if you survived, you carried your crimes like a disease. The best you could hope for was to die in silence. The worst would to be remembered. If you were a medieval assassin, your work began not with a mission, but with a whisper. A nobleman leaning too close in a tavern. A merchant servant slipping you a note. A monk who offered coin under the veil of confession. They never said the word kill. They didn't need to. You knew what was being asked. Those who hired assassins were always the powerful, wealthy lords, jealous heirs, corrupt clergy, or ambitious merchants. But they weren't looking for justice. They wanted silence, revenge, inheritance. Most had blood on their own hands already. You were just one more blade they could use without consequence. They dressed you in lies. He's a traitor, they'd say. She's a heretic. Sometimes they gave you details, sometimes just a name. You didn't ask questions. That was part of the deal. The less you knew, the less you could be tortured into saying, the less you lived with at night. Trust was a dangerous illusion. Even if you completed the job, your employer might decide you were too great a risk to leave alive. They had power, land, and soldiers. You had none of those. If they wanted you dead, you wouldn't make it to morning. Some patrons left you waiting for payment that never came. Others paid in cursed coin, money marked with symbols so local priests would refuse to bury you. Some gave you gold, then reported the murder to the constables themselves. You were just a tool. Broken tools were discarded. Every job came with the promise of death, not just for your target, but for you. Rival factions watched your movements. Loyal guards waited. A single misstep, and your employer could claim innocence while you screamed your last on a rope. The assassin never got a trial, just a noose. Sometimes the person you were sent to kill knew you were coming. Some clients double-crossed you and warned their rivals ahead of time, using you to send a message or to get you caught. A twisted kind of justice. One killer sent to kill another. You rarely saw it coming. The worst were the ones who looked you in the eye and thanked you. They smiled. They offered more work. Then they sent a second assassin for you the next night. Cleaning up after the kill, they called it. You were never meant to survive. You were just the beginning of a deeper game. The church sometimes employed assassins too, quietly of course. Heretics, pagans, apostates. Men who knew too much or women who wouldn't stay silent. You might receive a blessing with one hand and a poison vial with the other. Even priests made convenient liars. Every coin you earned was cursed with fear. You never looked anyone in the eye. You never slept in the same bed twice. You weren't a hero. You were a secret no one wanted spoken. And when your usefulness ran out, your life ended like your victims, alone, quickly, and without a name. In the world of medieval assassination, you killed with what you had. There were no blacksmiths forging specialty weapons for hired killers. You used what was cheap, hidden, and already dirty. Daggers, butcher knives, wooden clubs, whatever slipped beneath a cloak or fit in a boot. Most jobs were done not with grace, but with desperation. A knife could jam in bone. A club might take too long. Even a hammer blow could go wrong if your victim screamed before dying. Nothing about killing was precise. It was chaotic, bloody. The tools you carried weren't reliable. And neither were your hands when they started to shake. Swords were rare among assassins. Too long, too loud, and too obvious. Only fools or nobles carried them into narrow alleys. You needed something close and brutal. A dagger to the ribs, a garrote across the throat. Speed mattered more than spectacle. Poison was the assassin's dream. Kill without getting close. But the dream rarely worked. It was too slow, too suspicious. Someone always saw something, and poisons were often deadly to the touch. One drop on your fingers, one careless lick to seal the envelope, and you joined your target in the grave. Even if the poison worked, the death was rarely quiet. Convulsions, vomiting, screams, not exactly subtle. And when the villagers came running, they always asked who was near, who had touched the cup, who had delivered the bread. You didn't vanish. You were hunted. Some used garrotes, loops of rope, metal wire, even belts. Silent, yes, but hard to use. If your grip slipped, if your target thrashed, you ended up wrestling in the dirt like animals. Most kills weren't clean. They were loud, desperate, and fast. You had seconds to win, or you were dead. Sometimes you didn't even get a weapon. You had to use what was around you. A heavy brick, a jagged rock, a pitchfork leaning on a barn wall. The job didn't care how it was done, just that it was. Assassins weren't craftsmen. They were improvisers in blood. The tools didn't just fail you, they marked you. If caught, a bloodied knife in your belt was all the trial needed. You might try to toss it in a river, bury it in the dirt, but the stains on your hands were harder to hide. Even your smell could betray you. There were no rituals to it, no honor. You killed how you had to. Sometimes that meant smashing a skull with a rock or choking a man in his sleep. And afterward, you didn't walk away proud. You ran. You vomited. You shook. Killing was never clean. It was ugly work. The only thing consistent in your toolkit was fear. You feared being seen. You feared missing the strike. You feared what your hands had become. And every tool you used, every knife, every vial, every rope, carried the weight of that fear. None of them made it easier. They just helped you survive another day. Forget the secret guilds and ancient rituals. Most medieval assassins didn't train. They survived. There were no lessons in silent movement or classes on how to kill a man with one blow. You learned on the job, and most didn't last long enough to learn much at all. If you were lucky, you picked up tricks from others. Old criminals, bitter mercenaries, veterans too wounded to keep fighting. These weren't mentors. They were just survivors who had outlived someone else. They taught you how to stab quick, run fast and disappear into a crowd. That was the curriculum. There were no sparring rings or practice dummies. You trained by watching drunks brawl in taverns, by stabbing pigs, by imagining what would happen if the man at the bar stood up and pulled a sword. Every day was a test you might fail with your life. That was the only feedback. Assassins didn't have uniforms. They wore what peasants wore. Mud-slick tunics, patch boots, cloaks that smelled of smoke. If you looked too clean, people noticed. You had to blend in, to vanish into the background. The best assassin was the one no one remembered seeing. You didn't train your body. You let it harden through hunger and exhaustion. Carrying water for miles, sleeping in stables, running from patrols. The life itself forged you, not into a warrior, but into something lean, alert, and always ready to run. Some tried to train themselves by imitating the legends. They'd wrap cloth around their arms to practice silence, climb barn roofs to simulate castle walls. But fantasy and reality rarely matched. Slipping off a roof didn't make a poetic death. It just broke your leg and ended your career. There were no drills in poison preparation. You learned which plants killed by watching animals die. You ground herbs with shaking hands. You tested potions on strayed dogs or rats. It wasn't science. It was guesswork with a body count. Most assassins never learned more than the basics. How to get close, how to strike fast, how to run. There were no second chances to refine technique. One mistake meant death. Those who survived weren't the best killers. They were the best at vanishing. You trained your nerves more than your muscles. You learned to hide fear behind silence. To steady your hand even when your heart was racing. To lie without blinking. The assassin's greatest weapon wasn't the blade. It was the calm before using it. The truth was simple. You weren't trained. You were used. The people who hired you didn't care about your preparation. They just wanted someone else to die. And if you lived through it, you weren't congratulated. You were sent on the next job with the same broken tools and no promise of tomorrow. The city wasn't your sanctuary. It was your cage. To the medieval assassin, cities were traps of stone and suspicion. Narrow streets wound like veins, choking movement and killing escape. Buildings leaned overhead, pressing in. The city didn't hide you, it swallowed you. slowly, publicly, and with its eyes open. Every step echoed, every eye watched. A stranger in a medieval town might as well have been a ghost in daylight. Everyone noticed, and no one forgot. People gossiped in low voices. A limp, a strange accent, a rip in your cloak. All things that marked you. The city remembered faces, and that made you vulnerable. The streets weren't paved with stone and promise. They were layered in waste. Human and animal filth pooled in alleys. Chamber pots emptied onto walkways. You ran through sludge when you fled a scene, and it clung to your boots like guilt. If the blade didn't get you, infection might. The market was no better. Loud, crowded, but not safe. It was a theatre where everyone played a role. Vendor, customer, thief. You tried to blend in, but any twitch, any sudden motion, drew eyes. One wrong look, and the butcher behind the stall remembered what you wore. How you stood. How you didn't buy anything. Guards were not your enemy because they were trained. They were your enemy because they were bored and brutal. They roamed in pairs, gripping spears, itching to beat someone for amusement. If you looked poor, you were questioned. If you looked rich, you were robbed. If you looked afraid, you were arrested. At night, the city became something else entirely. The shadows moved differently. Lanterns threw twisted shapes. The silence was never complete. Always a dog barking, a scream from some window, the slow creak of wood. You didn't feel hidden in the dark. You felt exposed. The city breathed, and it knew you were there. Taverns were the assassin's tool and torment. You listened, watched, waited. But you were never welcome. You drank alone. You kept one hand near your belt. Drunks loved to test strangers. And the moment you stood to leave, a dozen eyes followed, wondering what your story was, and whether it should be told. There was no such thing as a clean escape. Cobblestone twisted beneath your feet. Stray dogs barked. Someone always shouted. Even if no one knew who you were, they knew you were running. And in a medieval city, the crowd didn't help you disappear. It turned to watch the show. You couldn't stay anywhere long. Inns were tight with gossip. If your face showed up too often, someone asked questions. If you paid too well, someone followed. You kept your hood on. You slept lightly. Sometimes you didn't sleep at all. You left before sunrise, your bed still warm, your name never given. Medieval cities didn't offer shelter. They offered odds. You placed your life against the city's memory, its mood, its smells and whispers. Each corner was a risk. Each stranger might be the last face you ever saw. You didn't walk those streets like a ghost. You walked them like a man on borrowed time. There were no trials for assassins. If you were caught, your fate was already sealed. Justice wasn't blind, it was brutal. The guards didn't ask questions. They beat you first, dragged you second, and let the magistrates gawk at you last. You were bloodied before you ever saw a courtroom. You weren't locked in clean cells with food and blankets. Medieval dungeons were holes in the earth, wet, cold and crawling. Chains rusted into your skin. The straw was mouldy. The air stank of old wounds and fear. Rats were your only visitors, and they didn't come to comfort you. Torture was not a secret. It was a process. First came the fists, then the iron. You might be stretched on the rack, your joints slowly pulled from their sockets. You might be branded, burned or bled. They asked questions, but they didn't need answers. They just needed to hear you scream. Sometimes, you confessed before the torture even began. You said what they wanted, named people who didn't exist, just to stop what was coming. But it didn't matter. Confessing didn't save you. It just changed the method of your execution. Public executions were the city's favorite show. They announced the time. They rang bells. Families brought bread and children. You were paraded through the streets, beaten, spat on, and tied in the square like livestock. It wasn't about justice. It was about entertainment. The executioner wore a mask, not for anonymity, but for ceremony. He wasn't ashamed. He was celebrated. Whether he used an axe, a rope, or fire, the people cheered. Your death was meant to scare them. Instead, it amused them. That was the worst part. If you were lucky, you were beheaded quickly. If not, you were hanged, drawn, and quartered, or burned, or broken on the wheel. The punishment depended on your crime and your mood that day. There was no consistency, only pain. Sometimes you weren't killed right away. They left you in the pillory for days, neck and wrists locked, as people threw waste and stones. Or they cut off a hand and let you live, marked forever. But most of the time, death was a mercy you earned through agony. There were no prayers for you, no burial rites. Your body was dumped in a pit or left hanging as a warning to others. Birds picked at your eyes. Rain rotted your skin. You became a part of the city's memory, a lesson in bones and silence. The city never remembered your name, just your punishment. Children grew up hearing stories about what happened to the man who stepped out of line. You weren't a martyr or a villain. You were a fading scream, a stain on the street, a silence where a voice used to be. There was always another blade in the shadows. Assassins didn't just kill noblemen and merchants, they killed each other. Rival contracts, jealous clients, or quiet silencing jobs turned the profession into a blood-soaked game of predator versus predator. It wasn't personal. It was survival. Sometimes you didn't even know there was another assassin until it was too late. One moment, you were waiting for your target to pass. The next, you were gasping, bleeding from a wound you never saw coming. You weren't the only one hired, and the job wasn't yours alone. Clients didn't care who did the job, only that it was done. Sometimes they hired two assassins, not to work together, but to ensure at least one succeeded. Whoever failed was considered disposable. If both succeeded, one became a loose end to be tied off. You killed your mark, and then checked your back. There were rumors of killer duels in the woods, two assassins meeting by chance while stalking the same prey, circling like wolves. Sometimes it ended in steel. Other times, it ended in a handshake and a split reward. But more often, one left and one stayed, face down in the mud. Sometimes you were sent after one of your own, a retired assassin, a failed hitman who talked too much, a former ally who took the wrong job. These were the worst missions because they knew you were coming. They'd trained for it. They were ready. Every assassin feared their own reflection. You never knew when someone would follow your path, learn your habits, wait for the right moment. You might feel a presence in the crowd, a twitch in the dark, the whisper of movement behind you. And by then, it was already over. There were stories of assassins killing their replacements. When a younger killer was brought in to take over, the older one didn't step aside. He made sure there was no one to replace him. Experience didn't guarantee survival, but it improved the odds when blades met in the dark. Some assassins teamed up briefly. They called it a partnership, but it was more like a truce with a timer. They'd help each other, then vanish before one got greedy. If the gold was high enough, the alliance ended in betrayal. You could never let your guard down, not even with a smile. You didn't win these encounters because you were better. You won because you were more desperate, or more paranoid, or just luckier. The difference between the hunter and the hunted was often one heartbeat, one breath, One step on the wrong floorboard in the night. In the end, assassins feared each other more than kings or knights. You could avoid a patrol. You could lie to a magistrate. But another assassin knew where to look, how to move, when to strike. And when they came for you, they came like you did. Silent, swift, and merciless. The king never called you by name. You were summoned in the night by a cloaked messenger, led through tunnels beneath stone walls, and brought before a noble who never made eye contact. The job was simple. Kill in silence. The king's enemies were your prey, and if you failed, you were never there to begin with. Royal contracts paid more, but they came with no forgiveness. A noble could let a failure slide. A merchant might threaten you, but a king made people vanish, entire families, villages. When you took the crown's coin, you gave up the right to live on your own terms. Your target might be a rival lord, a bishop, a diplomat from another kingdom. You'd have to travel far, disguise yourself, listen at doors, sleep in haylofts, and wait for your moment. The king never cared how it was done. He only cared that it was quiet and complete. You never met the king directly. His face was hidden behind gold and velvet. You dealt with advisors, chamberlains, and knights who smiled without warmth. If you asked too many questions, you were removed. Permanently. Even for the most elite assassin, proximity to the throne was a death sentence waiting to happen. If the mission involved another noble house, it got messy. You couldn't just stab and run. You had to make it look like sickness, like accident, like suicide. Sometimes you poisoned ink bottles. Sometimes you set fires. Each job was a performance, and your reward was staying alive. Royal assassins didn't get holidays, or homes, or names. You were known only by your silence. No one toasted to your victories. No one mourned your passing. When you succeeded, the court never acknowledged it. When you failed, they made an example out of your corpse. Sometimes the king's orders didn't come through words. Just a symbol, an emblem of a wolf scratched into wood, or a feather tucked beneath your plate at supper. You knew what it meant, and if you ignored it, you were marked for death. Refusing a royal job was treason. Some assassins bragged about working for kings, said it was the highest honor. But those men never got old. They died in wars that weren't theirs, over secrets they never knew. The crown paid well, but it buried you deeper with every coin. And the worst part, you could never refuse the next mission. Not once you started. Once you served the king, you were always being watched. You might finish a job and find a new contract waiting on your bed, or wake up to a knife at your throat if someone thought you knew too much. Working for the king didn't make you untouchable. It made you invisible. You were just another shadow behind the throne. One that moved when called, killed when commanded, and disappeared when no longer needed. And when you were gone, the crown never paused to remember your name. The killing didn't end when the blade was pulled free. It followed you into the quiet moments, into sleep, into hunger. The faces came back, eyes wide, mouths open, bodies twitching in final silence. Some assassins feared death, others feared sleep, because when you closed your eyes, they returned. At first, you told yourself it was survival, just a job. They deserved it. You needed the coin. But after a while, the excuses rot. You'd kill a man and forget his name within days. You'd stop asking why. Eventually, you didn't even remember what it felt like to care. Some turned to drink, others to herbs that dulled the mind. Anything to take the edge off the memories. But those tools had edges too. One drink too many, and you talked too loud. One wrong herb, and you stopped waking up. Nothing dulled the guilt without sharpening the risk. You started seeing things that weren't there. A glimpse of a face in a window. A shadow that didn't belong. The man you stabbed in the rain, now walking through a crowd. Guilt makes phantoms real. Your hands shook when they shouldn't. Your steps faltered in silence. You weren't hunted by guards. You were hunted by your mind. The worst part was the silence. When you weren't killing. When there was no mission, no order. Just the ticking of time and the weight of what you'd done. Some begged for new contracts, not for coin, but because killing was easier than remembering. Easier than being alone with your own name. Religion didn't help. Not after what you'd done. You could kneel, you could pray, but you knew what you were. The gods might forgive murderers, but they didn't forgive men who killed for coin. You stopped going to churches. The holy light felt like judgment, and you already knew the verdict. Some assassins tried to retire, change names, settle in a village, but they didn't sleep well. Every knock at the door felt like vengeance. Every glance in the market was suspicion. Many lasted a month before they packed up and vanished into the woods. Some didn't even make it a week. And then came the nightmares. The screams you never heard in life echoed in your sleep. Dead hands reached for your throat. Rooms filled with blood. You'd wake up clawing at the floor, biting your lip, whispering names you didn't remember killing. Some assassins cut their own throats to escape the dark. The paranoia never left. You couldn't trust food, or drink, or gifts. You checked every door twice. You listened for footsteps that might not exist, because you knew how easy it was to kill someone, and you knew how many people had reason to kill you. Every ally could be your end. In the end, it wasn't the guards or the kings or the victims that destroyed most assassins. It was the silence, the weight of memory, the endless questions you stopped asking. You didn't grow old. You unraveled. And when they found your body, if they found it at all, no one cried. They just whispered. One of them. No matter how many jobs you finished, no matter how quiet your blade, your story always ended the same way. Alone, forgotten, or hanging by the neck. Assassins didn't retire. They disappeared. And when they were remembered, it was only as a warning. Some tried to run. They left the cities behind, wandered into forests, changed names. But the past doesn't fade. A noble's grudge stretches across kingdoms. A widow's vengeance burns for years. And a former client, once nervous, becomes bold once the killing's done. Sooner or later, they found you. Others stayed until the end, took jobs until their hands shook too much to hold a blade. They grew careless, sloppy. They stabbed the wrong man, trusted the wrong contact. All it took was one slip, and the guards had a body to display and a name to curse. And then there were those who turned themselves in, too tired to run, too haunted to go on. They stood in the square, announced their sins, and waited for the rope. It wasn't courage, it was surrender. Death was quieter than the voices in their head. The hangman knew many assassins. Some came silently, others kicked and spat, but none left legends. Their names weren't carved into stone, their faces weren't drawn in books. Their bones lay in shallow graves outside city walls, unmourned, unblessed, and unmarked. A few assassins made it into the songs, briefly, twisted as villains, mockeries or cautionary tales. Minstrels turned them into shadows or demons. No one sang of their fear, their hunger, or their grief. Just the blood, just the murder. The assassin was entertainment, not memory. The lucky ones died clean. One cut in the night, one arrow in the chest, quick, forgotten. The unlucky ones, They were caught, tortured, paraded through town, hung from the gates, their corpses fed to dogs, their heads spiked on walls. Death came in degrees and mercy was rare. You didn't get a grave, you didn't get prayers. At best, you got a whisper. He used to be one of them, they'd say. Then silence. The world moved on. The noble lived. The king ruled. The taverns filled. Your story ended and no one looked back. You thought once that you'd leave a mark, that someone would remember you, that the things you did meant something, but you were just a shadow used by others. Your knife carved history that others claimed. When you died, you weren't erased. You were never written in the first place. This was the life of the assassin. Not glory, not legend, just footsteps in the dark, just coins spent by liars, just blood that never dried. And in the end, obscurity or the noose. Either way, no one came to find you. No one said your name aloud. You became a rumor, a warning, a whisper. When the plague came, it didn't just kill, it changed everything. Cities emptied, trade froze. Kings hid behind closed gates, and still, people wanted each other dead. Even as the world collapsed under disease, the assassin's blade found work. But now, the job came with something worse than swords. A cough in the dark. The plague didn't stop assassinations. It changed them. You were no longer just a killer. You were a ghost walking among the dying. Getting close to your target meant risking everything. Not from guards, but from breath, from blood, from a touch on your skin. You didn't need poison. The world was already full of it. Some targets begged to be spared, not from your blade, but from the plague. If you must kill me, they said, do it before the fever. Others wore charms, carried bones, whispered prayers. It didn't matter. A knife was still a cleaner death than rot from within. Clients still paid, but not with coin, with bread, with salt, with clean water. Gold had no value in a dying world. You weren't working for wealth anymore. You were working for survival. And sometimes, the target was just a man who'd taken the last loaf from the wrong baker. You couldn't stay in the city after a kill, not anymore. The plague spread faster than rumor. Streets were quarantined, whole districts sealed off. You ran not from the law, but from the sickness. One night in the wrong place, and your blade didn't matter. Many assassins died without ever touching a blade. They slipped into sick rooms and never came out, carried death on their boots, inhaled it while waiting in rafters. You didn't need to be caught to be punished. The Black Death was always watching, always waiting. Some killers embraced it. They became rumors. Men who carried the plague to their targets like a curse. They rubbed rags against the dead and left them on doorknobs. They smeared rot on the handles. They poisoned not food but air. You didn't see the strike. You just saw the coughing start. Churches rang bells every hour. Streets echoed with the cries of the dying. And in the middle of it, you moved, one job at a time. But the killings felt different now. They didn't weigh the same. The line between murder and mercy blurred. You began to wonder if you were helping some of them. You lost comrades. Fellow assassins vanished. Some were burned in mass graves. Others simply stopped showing up. No funerals, no goodbyes. You began to speak to the dead, not out of madness, but out of loneliness. The job was already cursed. The plague only finished what your work had started. When it finally came for you, whether by blade, cough, or betrayal, no one wept, no one buried you. You were just another body in the blackened streets, in a world where death was everywhere. Even the killer became forgettable. The plague didn't change the assassin's fate. It just sped it up. They rarely wrote her name down. She didn't appear in the court records or the bard's verses. But she was there, in the shadows, in the kitchens, in the bedrooms of the powerful. Women were not trained assassins. They were invisible ones. And sometimes, invisibility was the sharpest weapon of all. She wasn't handed a blade. She stirred poison into the tea. She left the door unlocked for someone else. She slipped a ribbon over her neck and pulled. Her kills weren't dramatic. They were quiet, domestic, doubtful. It must have been illness, they said. A tragic accident. She smiled and served the next meal. The most feared killers weren't always cloaked in black. Some wore linen aprons. Some whispered lullabies to sleeping victims. One posed as a midwife, another a lady's maid. They knew when men let down their guard, after drink, in bed, during prayer. That's when they struck. That's when no one suspected. Many of them never took coin. They killed for love, or for revenge, or to escape. A mistress poisoned her lord to end the beatings. A barmaid slit a merchant's throat after he ruined her sister. Their motives weren't always mercenary, but the results were just as final. The church feared them. It called them witches, heretics, vessels of the devil. A woman who killed wasn't just dangerous, she was unnatural. Burn her, drown her, erase her. Not because she killed, but because she did so without permission, without asking, without mercy. Some were never caught. They moved from town to town, changed their name, disguised their past behind clean fingernails and humble jobs. A few even remarried, lived long lives, died grandmothers. No one knew how many people they'd sent to the grave. Only that they always knew when to smile. They killed other women too, for jealousy, for betrayal, for power. One noble woman paid her cook to poison her husband's mistress. Another smothered a rival in a convent. The gender of their victims didn't matter. What mattered was control and vengeance. The tools they used were not daggers. They were candles, ropes, pins dipped in venom. They used hairpins to jab into soft flesh. They used corset laces to choke. A pillow pressed just right. A window latch left loose before a fatal fall. Their violence was clever because it had to be. They were never awarded titles, never recruited by kings. But their names passed in whispers, especially among the nobility. Don't cross her, they'd say. She has the look. In a world where women were expected to be silent, the deadliest ones let their actions speak louder than any oath. History erased them. The scribes didn't write about the milkmaid who ended a bishop's reign. They didn't record the nun who slit a general's throat in confession. But the silence speaks. The gaps in the records. The deaths with no suspects. She is there in the quiet between the pages.